Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're taking a look at Shards of Order, a dark fantasy deck-building RPG with a unique twist on traditional turn-based combat. I must admit, I'm a bit of a noob when it comes to card-based games. I've played a decent bit of Hearthstone and Marvel Snap, and quite enjoyed Elder Scrolls Legends back in the day, but I've never latched on to games like Inscription or Slay the Spire the way some others have. Shards of Order initially grabbed my attention with its art style, reminiscent of Dark Souls or other similarly bleak titles, but I ended up loving its gameplay loop more than anything else in this surprisingly robust package, thanks in large part to a very clever twist that helps set it apart from turn-based contemporaries. This isn't a roguelike either. It's a straight-up RPG with a well-developed and enticing world, interesting NPCs, and multi-step questlines, along with choice and consequence that made exploring this setting a pure joy. It isn't perfect, and stumbles a bit with dialogue, minor performance issues, and some mostly personal gripes with deck building. But overall, the roughly 20 hours I spent with Shards of Order left me not only wanting more, but thankful I gave it a shot, as it turned out to be one of this year's best gaming surprises. In Shards of Order's brutal, eldritch, and often horrifying world, you command a trio of travelers as they journey across different environments, all full of characters, puzzles, and battles that test not only your deck building and card playing prowess, but your intelligence and morals as well. Conquering these zones grants new levels and gear, which unlock additional and upgraded cards and abilities that, when combined with the armor, weapons, and trinkets you find, gradually identify and refine each hero's various builds. As the party grows in strength and experience, they'll face new and tougher opponents, including a fantastic roster of bosses that are not only brutally difficult at times, but all feature unique mechanics, striking visuals, and beautiful soundtracks that coalesce to make each encounter absolutely sublime. Eventually, based on the decisions made during these adventures, you'll be confronted with a final choice on how to restore order in this fractured world. And this choice will have reality-altering consequences for everyone involved. Aside from its unique time-based gameplay that we'll discuss in a bit, Shards of Order doesn't revolutionize any of the genres it pulls from, but each element it borrows is well implemented, and the sum of their parts results in an experience that feels simultaneously familiar, yet fresh enough to stand out, too. Some systems are less robust than those in competing titles, but nothing crucial feels entirely absent, and whether you're a fan of difficulty, deck builders, or Dark Souls adjacent universes, there's something here to get you through the door and plenty to keep you hooked afterwards. Shards of Order isn't my typical flavor of RPG, but I love finding new games to enjoy and discuss, so if you like expanding your palette, discussing all kinds of titles, or just love talking about video games like I do, consider subscribing. In Shards of Order, you play as the Soldier, a former member of the brutal Blackwing Legion who has awoken with no recollection of why you were cast out by your comrades, the events that led you here, or even your own name. This world, known as the Continent, is governed by various laws that dictate reality itself, ranging from the passage of time to the finality of death. But something has gone terribly wrong, as the dead are no longer staying that way, instead becoming mindless, violent creatures known as the Lost. Things need to be made right, and as the soldier sets off to reclaim his memory and restore the laws, he encounters two new allies, the Exile and the Scholar, who form an uneasy alliance based on mutual survival more than anything else. Both have distinct personalities, the Exile being soft-hearted and always willing to help others, while the Scholar is more cold and calculated. Their backstories and motivations are gradually revealed, and while they are by no means among the best companions in gaming, they were enjoyable enough to travel with. The soldier's own inner voice also makes itself known, offering advice with a clearly self-serving slant, and you can choose whether to take its words to heart or fight against that influence. That flexibility extends to interacting with your companions, keeping them at arm's length, or nurturing these alliances into more than just a matter of convenience. And these types of choices extend to the wider world as well. All manner of NPCs abound, ranging from simple villagers to the Guardians, powerful beings entrusted with safekeeping specific laws, but can also succumb to the temptation of using these powers for personal gain instead. There is plenty of choice and consequence, ranging from resolving simple squabbles to that final decision on the fate of the world. These often come with unintended side effects, and their impact is constantly felt throughout the story. The continent itself is also well constructed, with plenty of fantastical terminology and interconnected plot points, but these elements never felt tacked on or out of place, and I was quite impressed by the constant immersion within this universe. While its overarching narrative and world building are excellent, character interactions are a mixed bag. Some are quite surface level, but others feature banter, disagreements, and emotional payoffs that temper those weaker beats. The English localization also leaves much to be desired, and is marred by improper grammar, contextual errors, or in the most egregious cases, entirely incorrect characters referenced during quests, or text just completely missing. I am willing to give a bit of grace on this, as developer Fardust is a small studio of non-native English speakers. Nothing is ever rendered completely unintelligible, and they have released post-launch updates to correct at least some of these issues. However, this remains a very noticeable problem, especially when the vast majority of dialogue is conveyed through writing alone, with voice acting relegated to cutscenes and a couple of collectibles. There was also an unfortunate instance where I stumbled into a location not meant to be entered yet, which then skipped over an entire chunk of the main quest, impacting its pacing, flow, and comprehension significantly. The flexibility to engage with dynamic storytelling outside of strictly structured sequences is great, and undoubtedly true to that Souls inspiration, but due to its narrative impact, I'd still advocate for locking this area behind quest progression. There are at least two possible endings, one good and one bad, of which I was locked into the latter. This took me completely by surprise, as I embodied a goody two-shoes my entire playthrough, the same way I do in all my RPGs. This made sense in hindsight, but was quite jarring in the moment, which I expect is exactly what Fardust intended. Without getting into spoilers, be very careful about any choices you make, as they can affect that final outcome substantially. There are some issues with delivery, but the game's narrative, characters, and world were all ultimately quite solid, and I didn't expect to enjoy this tale nearly as much as I did. Shards of Order's gameplay revolves around traversing its overworld map while overcoming combat encounters and completing quests. There is a central hub connecting its different zones, which all have their own NPCs to meet, battles to beat, and other smaller locations to explore. Each main area is distinct in its visuals, soundtrack, and enemies, although they all share that common tinge of darkness, dread, and horror that permeates this experience from top to bottom. Some areas can only be accessed by completing puzzles, obtaining items, or advancing quests, and experiencing everything this world has to offer will require a conscious effort to do so. Each locale features distinct NPCs, often serving as quest givers, but also narrative tools to move these stories forward. The tasks handed out were solid for the most part, often multi-step and requiring travel between different locations, or even retracing your steps back to previous ones. Some featured simple objectives like killing an enemy or finding an object, but others were more complex, often including secondary elements and multiple avenues for completion that could change their outcome entirely. These often had permanent effects on the world state too, and several quests could be resolved entirely without bloodshed. Peaceful resolutions require more effort to achieve, but those with a more straight-to-the-point style can always cut down these problems without a second thought. Some of the best encounters were entirely optional, and included nice changes of pace like non-combat challenges, puzzles, and riddles. Nothing too complicated as long as you're paying attention. There are plenty of items to discover, from new gear to lore collectibles, and while beelining through the main story is feasible, some of the best content was optional, and taking the time to explore always felt rewarding. Small interactions like an optional conversation when returning to a location prompted by dialogue alone contributed to an impressive level of detail that helped this world feel reactive and well-constructed. While exploring the overworld is what gets you moving, the main focus is deck building and card-centric combat, which is where Shards of Order really stands out and cements itself as a truly memorable experience. Decks and cards are nothing new in gaming, but Shards takes a different approach to their function in combat. Instead of adhering to strict turns or mana costs, gameplay is all about the cost of time. Each card and enemy action has an associated time expenditure, resulting in a back and forth where you must counter, extend, or circumvent your opponent's moves in the corresponding time frame. It's easy to grasp right from the start, but as more complex mechanics are introduced, that core gameplay remains while simultaneously gaining depth and complexity thanks to cost modifiers, build crafting, and more. Drawing cards, ordering actions, and preparing for enemy attacks as their timers count down combine to create an awesome loop that is digestible and enjoyable from those first moments all the way through the final boss. Another cool aspect is shared deck management, where all three characters' cards are combined into a single deck that is drawn through, discarded, or removed from play, then reshuffled once again. Deciding whether to balance your repertoire around one specific hero or try to keep all three viable is a cornerstone of this deck-building strategy. Each hero, as you've probably noticed I've been calling them, has their own playstyle and corresponding set of abilities, with all the requisite strengths and weaknesses one would expect. The soldier focuses on melee attacks with his giant sword, and has a rage meter that is filled by performing specific actions. Once full, it provides a unique attack that can be played at no cost. The meter then resets and needs to be filled once again, with the level of effort required and effects provided both modified by different abilities and pieces of gear. The Exile is focused on ranged combat, which revolves around the process of loading her quiver, then unleashing devastating volleys of arrows with her bow, all of which can be buffed in a myriad of ways. She has a host of abilities that add more arrow slots, reduce the potency of enemy attacks with a weakness debuff, and actions empowered by discarding other cards that provide bonuses or draw additional projectiles. The Scholar will be very familiar to those who have played Expedition 33, and is a spellcaster like Lune, whose potency and abilities are determined not only by his own actions, but those of his comrades as well. Each card played adds mana to one of 3 pools associated with that hero. Once specific amounts are obtained, the Scholar can cast stronger spells or improve their effects by consuming that mana, which must be regenerated before being used again. The range of these spells is diverse, but he can also focus his build around the Rot effect, which deals scaling damage to affected enemies based on the number of instances inflicted. Unfortunately, I didn't spec into this until the endgame, but it was absolutely busted, and watching enemy health bars melt away in the face of all that poison was awesome. This interplay is applicable to all 3 heroes, as sequencing abilities to provide the most damage, generate healing or shields, and apply or counter buffs and debuffs make combat consistently dynamic. As the party overcomes encounters, they level up and obtain skill points to spend within their respective trees. These unlock new cards or add more copies to your deck, along with upgrades to increase their potency. Cards can also be obtained from world encounters, quest decisions, and NPCs, but the majority come from these trees, which are massive and diverse, offering several focused builds for each character. Crafting a strong deck, then drawing and playing cards to create the perfect combo feels amazing, and Fardust absolutely nailed that aspect of deck building and card-based battles. While excellent overall, the single biggest gameplay weakness was that wielding a smaller, focused deck felt much stronger than branching out into wider, more diverse options. Genre veterans are probably rolling their eyes right now. And yes, deck thinning and draw consistency are absolutely some of the most powerful mechanics in any card game. But while the minimum deck requirement is 18 cards, I often ran with more than 30, and these wider decks still felt viable until reaching the game's hardest encounters. That also sounds like a no-brainer, but I would have enjoyed a bit more leeway with building decks wide instead of just tall, mostly because there are so many cool abilities to test out and experience. This playstyle absolutely made some fights harder, but narrowing things down was always a surefire solution, and if you're ever stumped on a fight, trim your deck, then go back to a more inefficient pile of cards later. It's a testament to Fardust's design that I always wanted to try new cards and deck compositions, and getting into the groove with new abilities and unlocking powerful combos kept combat consistently engaging. Skills can be fully respec'd at any time outside of combat, although there was no respec all option, which made the process quite tedious. But this has been updated post-launch to reduce that friction. There are also brief opportunities to play as characters outside that core trio, providing a little tease of some ideas Fardust had for other heroes. These were distinct and enjoyable, and made me wish they were part of the actual roster, as each was awesome to pilot and strong in their own right. Who knows, maybe we'll get lucky with some DLC in the future. Beyond their arsenal of cards, each hero can also equip a weapon, armor, and memory, which all provide different buffs and bonuses. The soldier's sword dictates what ability is granted by his rage meter, while the exile's bow and scholar's staff provide boons like loading additional arrows or increasing mana gains. Unlike weapons and armor, memories can be equipped by any hero, and provide effects like drawing extra cards or increasing enemy timers. A second slot is eventually unlocked too, enabling even more creativity. Gear can optimize or even enable entirely new builds, and experimenting always felt awesome, with plenty of resources provided to upgrade multiple loadouts, boosting their effects and keeping them viable. Alongside health, characters can build up a number of shields, the capacity for which is dictated by their armor. These absorb damage until fully depleted, at which point their base health becomes vulnerable again. Shields can be filled and buffed by armor and abilities, and are a crucial element of staying alive, as actual healing options during combat are severely limited. Enemies can utilize shields as well, and these were some of the toughest foes to bring down. Speaking of, we should go over the awesome roster of combatants you'll be facing off against across the continent. Enemy variety in Shards of Order is simply staggering. Not only are there all manner of gross, nasty creatures to battle, but each features distinct attacks and movesets that require different strategies to overcome. Enemies attack directly, of course, but what is often even more dangerous are the various buffs, debuffs, and secondary effects they inflict to wear the party down. These range from reducing the potency of each hero's cards, to restricting movement or building up deadly attacks that can only be negated by dealing enough damage before the timer ends. Enemies don't target specific heroes, but instead positions in your formation. Moving characters and using abilities that buff them while doing so was another mechanic to master, an added layer of complexity. There are so many more effects too. Self-reviving enemies that must all be downed at once, or that shuffle dud cards into your deck. And while some felt a bit tedious at times, they were all unique and introduced at the perfect pace. From huge swarms of Lost that buff one another and attack in droves, amalgamations of different beasts, or terrifying monsters seemingly pulled straight from a body horror movie, not one single enemy felt phoned in. Many fights featured secondary elements to contend with, like saving an NPC from being burned alive or destroying the source of respawning foes, and these were some of the most difficult but memorable battles. Some encounters could even be resolved non-violently, either by preparing properly or paying attention to hints provided beforehand, and the ways to approach these challenges were also incredibly varied. Despite all those gameplay elements, the UI is incredibly well designed to track them, with tooltips for gear, status effects, and any other information needed to help avoid confusion. Combat is consistently engaging and requires real effort to find success, but this excellence was never more apparent than during its exquisite boss fights, which were where its impressive design shined the brightest. Every boss featured its own unique mechanics, awesome visuals, and a soundtrack that perfectly accentuated these high-stakes encounters. I can still recall them all, a credit to how well these fights were constructed. Their visual and audio designs were absolutely wild, with models and sound effects that would feel right at home in any Souls-like. They also featured plenty of interesting mechanics, each unique to that specific fight. They were never reused or recycled, and all felt complex, rich, and deeply enjoyable. There was one pair of late-game bosses that gave me hell, and eventually drove me to thin my deck to overcome them. Not due to frustrating gameplay or poor design, but because these fights were fucking hard. Through deck tweaks and persistence, I was finally able to overcome them, and that difficulty took nothing away from their excellent design, consistent with all those other big-name encounters. There are no difficulty options in Shards of Order, and while the game can be challenging at times, it's never in a way that feels artificial or unfair, which is exactly the kind of difficulty I prefer. Whether wishing for a tough gauntlet or more laid-back experience, the game strikes a balance that should keep most folks happy, or at the very least, feeling like overcoming its obstacles is manageable. Those couple of outliers aside, most encounters took between 1 and 5 attempts to conquer. Not bad at all, and I'll happily blame any extended struggles on my own personal deficiencies above all else. So long as one character remains alive during combat, heroes can be revived, but this introduces the fracture mechanic. Each time a new hand is redrawn after, the entire party takes damage, which scales higher based on the number of revives during that fight. Regardless of skill or luck, these heroes will die, and when all 3 go down, they're sent back to the previous checkpoint to respawn and try again. Death is broken in this world after all. Nothing is lost when dying, but any combat encounters between the point of demise and last bonfire will need to be conquered again. Checkpoints are fairly generous, however, and while 1 or 2 fights may need repeated to claw back lost progress, once a new fire is lit, they will be permanently cleared from the map. These rest stops do restore health, but the party doesn't automatically heal after each encounter, so managing their vitality not only in the moment, but while planning for what lies ahead is crucial. This can throw a wrench into things when faced with a sequence of tough fights, and each battle only grants XP after its initial completion, so there's no dying and going back to farm experience either. The ethereal eyeball can heal your heroes as a last resort, or prepare them for another bout with the enemy, and I should mention that real quick. During combat, there's a creepy eyeball staring from the corner of the screen, which if implored, can resurrect any fallen heroes, restore the party to full health, and add a random, tarot-like card to your hand. That healing alone is incredibly powerful, extending fights beyond what is otherwise possible. But while the health and cards it provides might seem like a helping hand, they often come with unwanted side effects. You might one-shot a dangerous enemy, or you could end up wiping away all of the buffs you've been working so hard to build up on your heroes. so think carefully before accepting its favor. This adds a bunch of fun quirks and further variety to combat, sometimes helping and sometimes hurting, but be wary of relying on it too much, since who knows what other side effects abusing its power might incur. There were some very minor gripes with combat overall, like how targeting enemies with your cards could be a little fickle at times, but nothing remotely bad enough to detract from it in any meaningful way. Despite my own personal learning curve, Shards of Order was an absolute joy to play, and offers one of the most memorable spins on turn-based, or as I like to call it, time-based combat since Clair Obscur. Shards of Order's visuals were what originally grabbed my attention, and Fardust absolutely delivered, with an excellent art style, character and environment designs, along with a soundtrack that absolutely slaps. Right from the main menu, this music is amazing, and that high quality level continues throughout the entire experience. There aren't a ton of tracks, but each song that accompanies conversation, exploration, and combat encounters is so well fitted to the occasion that they more than make up for that small number with their placement and quality. From the very first boss fight, these tracks in particular were phenomenal, featuring wild combinations of chanting, orchestral tones, and what sounded like Viking battle cries. Fardust blends a bunch of really cool shit together, and it all comes out perfectly. And while each of these tracks are great, that boss music is truly exceptional, and almost worth the price of admission alone. There is some minimal voice acting and cutscenes and a few collectibles, and it's all fine, but everything else is left to the player to read. So if you aren't down with that, Shards unfortunately isn't the type of game for you. Sound effects during combat are solid, although admittedly a step down from that wonderful soundtrack. Characters shout as they dish out and receive damage, slashing swords and flying arrows sound on point, and I had no real complaints. My only gripe was that the general audio level was a tad too quiet, even with the in-game levels cranked all the way up, but that took nothing away from the otherwise exquisite design. Even more impressive were the game's visuals, which perfectly encapsulate its grossly awesome design direction, with all kinds of body horror themes, creatures grafted onto one another, and distorted humanoids and monsters. This is all very reminiscent of FromSoft's visual motifs, and having played through Bloodborne for the first time earlier this year, I was constantly reminded of things like Ludwig and the One Reborn, a true credit to Fardust's work. Character portraits during dialogue are also quite good, with an almost demigod-like quality that extends to their models in combat. And similarly, enemy and boss designs are also incredible. From the zombie-like Lost to those nasty animal hybrids, corrupted soldiers, and eldritch abominations. Each enemy looks fantastic and perfectly embodies this world and its constant, overwhelming brutality and darkness. Gameplay animations are also solid, whether dragging cards onto enemies or attacks and abilities playing out. They are all colorful in a way that doesn't negate that darker tone while breaking up the doom and gloom just enough, and it comes together perfectly. Finally, card art itself is also excellent, featuring cool designs thematic to each hero that also stay readable in the heat of combat. When it comes to settings and performance, there's really not much to say, mostly in a good way. There's a very basic options menu where volume and screen resolution can be tweaked, which is pretty anemic, but also serviceable for a title like this. Performance was rock solid for the vast majority of my playthrough. Running on a Ryzen 7 7800X3D and NVIDIA 5080, there were only a handful of minor frame drops during combat, none of which had a noticeable impact on my enjoyment. There was also the occasional screen flicker, mostly while traversing the overworld, but this only happened a handful of times as well. I didn't test things on my Steam Deck, and while it isn't verified, the devs have talked at length about optimization efforts for that version, so poke around a bit before buying if a handheld playstyle piques your interest. I also experienced zero bugs, localization issues aside, and I'm always happy to report when that part of a game holds up so exceptionally well. Shards of Order took me just over 25 hours to complete, chasing down everything I could possibly find, but that number is really closer to 20 when subtracting those boss fights that gave me so much trouble, and skilled players can absolutely get through it in about half that time. Regardless of your familiarity with the genre or intended pace of play, for $10 US, the game delivers an exceptional experience that is absolutely worth playing, for both veterans and more unfamiliar tourists like me. It was a bit outside my wheelhouse, but I'm so glad I gave it a try, because its visuals, soundtrack, gameplay, and world design were all phenomenal, and left quite a lasting impression. All I've been thinking about since wrapping up my first playthrough is how much I want to dive back in with a fresh save and go for that alternate ending. And when a game has you itching to come back for more right after the credits roll, that's a pretty good sign it's doing something special. Ultimately, Shards of Order is a fantastic bite-sized experience, and Fardust has delivered one of 2026's best surprises so far. For its price point and the value this small but mighty package provides, I cannot recommend it enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more gaming content, and let me know your thoughts on Shards of Order in the comments below. Has its time-based combat or unnerving art style convinced you to give it a go? Or will you sit this one out in favor of a new roguelike deck builder or traditional RPG instead? Either way, thank you for watching. You're a real one and I appreciate you, and hope to see you in the next one. Catch you later!